Welcome. I'm Dr. John Panero. It's great to see this turnout tonight, especially considering the weather. It's always a dicey thing, coming as it does Thomas Aquinas' feast day during winter in Grand Rapids, but it's good to see a good turnout. I'd like to introduce now Father Bob Keller, who is going to give us our invocation tonight.
Thank you, John. I reduced the 20 pages down to this. So let us pray. Dear Lord God, you are. You make known to us yourself as the source of all being and of all beings. How beautiful you are. Although we do not see you face to face, your creation mirrors a splendor in balance, design, and endeavors. How privileged are we that you dwell in the core of our souls, for in you we live and move and have our being. Let us not live our lives unconscious to this splendor, O Lord. O Holy Spirit, enkindle in us the gifts by which we know, love, and serve you with generous hearts. May we develop the habits to sustain and support this creation as your good stewards, and our own souls as your sanctuary, and come to see more clearly your kingdom come on earth as it is in heaven. We ask through Christ our Lord. Amen.
This lecture is co-sponsored by Campus Ministry and also Catholic Studies. It's part of the Catholic Studies Speaker Series. I would encourage you, if you're not already doing so, to follow Catholic Studies on Facebook and also on Twitter. Check out our webpage. Our webpage contains links to some of the past lectures in this speaker series. So that would include Bishop Robert Barron, although he was in Father Robert Barron, and then he spoke for us, and a week later, I don't know. And we've got Eleanor Stump on there, George Weigel, Sister Mary Prudence Allen, who says that she gets more hits off the Aquinas YouTube page than anything else she has posted online, and a host of others we could name. While I'm thinking of that, we did have Peter Kraft here once before, and I've invited him back for this summer, and he's agreed to come. He'll be here June 15th or 16th. I'm not sure which. So there'll be more information forthcoming, and that's another reason, I think, to check out the Facebook page and announcements. The Catholic Studies minor remains a program in which students can explore the rich culture of the Church's own tradition through a variety of academic disciplines. Students can also earn that minor in Rome during fall semesters or over a short summer stay in Krakow, Poland at the John Paul II Institute. And they can, of course, earn it here, too. I mean, Grand Rapids is a pretty cool city. 75 Aquinas students have spent a semester in Rome since we launched that program in 2010 in cooperation with Thomas More College of the Liberal Arts. We only had one student go last year for, I think, obvious reasons, but we'll see what the future holds. Speaking of Kraft, I once heard him say, actually here in Grand Rapids, that one cannot be bored by beauty or too filled with truth, because we're created to be drawn to these. And so I'd like to make, before I introduce our speaker, brief mention of three events related to beauty. One is next Thursday at Sacred Heart Church at 6:30 p.m., that's February 3rd, Dr. Daniel Wagner, our head of philosophy here at Aquinas College, will be speaking at the Authenticum lecture series there on, quote, Plato and Aristotle on the good and the beautiful. Dr. Wagner, that'd be 3-4 hours, you think? That's a big topic. Okay, he's here with us tonight. On March 18th, during the afternoon, the first Aquinas College Symposium on the True, Good, and the Beautiful sponsored by the philosophy department, and the writing center will be held. So they are currently soliciting proposals from students, faculty, and staff, and the deadline for that is February 4th. You can submit any questions you have about that to Dr. Wagner or to Matthew Stace, the student whom I understand is actually running the symposium. And finally, one of Aquinas College's two neighborhood Catholic schools, we're in the parish technically of St. Thomas, but over there at St. Stephen's, they're launching a new Way of Beauty curriculum, where they're going to even have, I understand, workshops, studios, real hands-on art and beauty learning, even an on-site greenhouse where students will be learning to discover beauty and create it through handiwork and the fine arts, and that'll be integrated with the liberal arts curriculum. And that creativity, they hope, will be a gift that they can then put at the service of others. So that's something interesting going on quite close to Aquinas College in the neighborhood here. And so to the main event tonight. The University of St. Thomas in Houston has been good to Aquinas. First, by way of that fine Catholic university several years ago, we welcomed to our faculty Sister Damian Marie Savino, our Dean of Science and Sustainability. And then we hired Dr. Wagner as our head of philosophy, who, among other things, is the co-founder of the Society for 21st Century Thomism. And now our speaker, James Matthew Wilson, who manages to teach at St. Thomas, but live in Grand Rapids. And how he does this is not for me to say, but he assures me bilocation remains purely aspirational at this time. I first met Professor Wilson years ago at a T.S. Eliot conference here in Grand Rapids, co-sponsored by the Russell Kirk Center for Cultural Renewal and at GVSU. And there he spoke. You might not remember what you spoke on there, but it was on Jacques Maritain, Neo-Thomism, and Eliot. Professor Wilson also spoke for the Catholic Studies Speaker Series back in 2018, and now he's a professor of humanities and the founding director of the Master of Fine Arts program in creative writing at the University of St. Thomas in Houston. An award-winning scholar of philosophical theology and literature, he's authored dozens of essays, articles, and reviews on all manner of subjects, secular and divine, and especially on those where we see the two in their intrinsic relation as truth, goodness, and beauty and being disclose themselves in art and culture, in the political and intellectual life, in our quest for self-knowledge, in the contemplation of God. His scholarly work especially focuses on the meeting of aesthetic and ontological form, where the craftsmanship of artwork discloses the truth about being. A poet, literary critic, and award-winning scholar, he's the author of several books of poetry, numerous essays, including The Vision of the Soul. I think there's at least one copy on the back table there, so there is a table with a few books back there for sale after the lecture. His most recent books are The Strangeness of the Good, published by Angelico in 2020, and the poetic sequence The River of the Immaculate Conception, published in 2019. The title of tonight's talk is Thomas Aquinas and the Modern Arts, the Beauty of Being. Please welcome James Matthew Wilson.
Thanks, everybody, for being here this evening. It's a thrill to be back here with you on Aquinas' campus once again, and to be able to speak to all of you and to see so many familiar as well as new faces. So thank you, John, for your hospitality, to everybody here at Aquinas. So I know we're a day early, but we're gathered here to celebrate the feast of St. Thomas Aquinas. And for some people, I don't expect that's the case here, given the number of white habits I'm seeing, but for many people, this will seem a rather arcane occasion to be celebrating this 13th century priest and philosopher. And indeed, as I was thinking of Aquinas in anticipation of my comments tonight, I was reminded of one of the great sort of somewhat modern touchstones for thinking about Aquinas, and that's, I think I'm going to flip here, And that's the fellow down in the lower right-hand corner there, Henry Adams, the great-grandson of John Quincy Adams, distinguished American historian, who published in 1904 a book called Mont Saint-Michel and Chartres. And the cumulative final chapter of that volume was called simply Thomas Aquinas. And there, Adams celebrates the genius of Aquinas. He refers to Aquinas as having built an intellectual cathedral, the thought of nearly 2 millennia of Catholicism, well, a millennia of Catholicism at that time, summed up in Adams' telling in a perfect system or a beautiful architecture that once again looks like a cathedral. And that's not Chartres, that's Mont Saint-Michel there, but it's such an amazing picture. I thought I would give it as an example just in case you hadn't seen a cathedral before. What Adams has to say about Aquinas is fascinating. He tells us that the thought of Thomas Aquinas has buried in the dust everyone who came after Aquinas. He gives a nice catalog of the modern philosophers, Descartes, Leibniz, and so on and so forth. They've all gone to the dust while Aquinas stands tall. But when Adams says that Aquinas stands tall, he means it kind of as a figure of speech. The beauty of this cathedral of thought still stands as a beautiful cathedral. It just doesn't stand as an image of truth. Aquinas, for Adams, is a figure of the perfect realization of civilization, of culture, and of the mind that we wish we could have in the 20th century, but is to be denied to us. And so there's a melancholic tone in Adams' discussion in the book, because everything he's celebrating, including the beautiful architecture of Mont Saint-Michel, is beautiful architecture, a carapace whose life is now gone and can only be looked back at, eulogized, memorialized, appreciated for its beauty, but it can have no cogency for us. If I don't have my years confused, 1904 is the year that Adams published his volume, Mont Saint-Michel and Chartres. It's also the same year that G.K. Chesterton published his first novel, The Napoleon of Notting Hill, which is one of the great stories of our century. And in the opening pages of Chesterton's novel, it does not begin the way most novels do, by telling a story. If those of you who know Chesterton know that he has to clear his throat for 5 to 10 pages before we can do anything like that. So he spends the first 5 pages talking about how modern people like to play a game, or human beings in general like to play a game called Cheat the Prophet. And what that means is, but in Chesterton's telling, is that all the social scientists, the social engineers, the administrators of the government will plan exactly, will remark trends, and will see exactly where those trends are leading. And so then those trends become a fact, a necessary truth. Society is going this way. And just when it seems as if they're going to converge upon some specific point, and history is realized inevitably according to the predictions of the prophets or the social scientists, the point swerves. Human beings, when you think that everything about them is determined, they suddenly decide to do something different. And so my story, the story I want to tell you tonight, is a way in which Thomas Aquinas cheats the prophets, the way in which, in the words of Mark Twain, the news of his death were somewhat exaggerated. I think the way best to do it is to have a look at this fellow, my beloved James Joyce. James Joyce is generally regarded as the greatest of the modernist novelists. Alongside T.S. Eliot, you might say they defined an age between them. In Joyce's first novel, A Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man, something strange happens. But to make it sound strange, I have to give you a little bit of background. So those of you who don't know this novel, Portrait of the Artist, it's it retells the story of Joyce's own youth with certain key differences in place, but under the name of, with Joyce played by the figure of Stephen Dedalus. And in the novel, we hear of Stephen's early childhood, his schooling, and his growing up. And by the fifth of 5 books in the novel, he's a student at the Catholic University of Ireland, the college that was founded by John Henry Newman and briefly taught or briefly professed by the English poet and convert Gerard Manley Hopkins. Stephen has already established himself as a man of letters, although without any sort of justification other than, as so many of us writers learn the hard way, other by way of pretension. And so his friends, his teachers, they from time to time ask him, when are we going to have something from you, Dedalus, on aesthetics? In other words, when are we going to get a philosophy of beauty from you? And Stephen, as he's wandering through the streets of Dublin, reflects to himself that he doesn't really know very much. All he has, and these are Joyce's words, is a garner of slender sentences from Aristotle's Poetics and Psychology, and a synopsis philosophiae scholasticae ad mentem divi tomai, a philosophical synthesis, scholastic philosophical synthesis according to the mind of Thomas Aquinas. So let's contemplate this for just 1 second before we look a little more deeply at what Joyce actually gives us. A Portrait of the Artist, Joyce is considered the greatest of the modernist novelists. His first, and probably in long term his most lasting novel, though not his most famous at present, is the one that we're discussing right now, Portrait of the Artist. If modernism means anything, modernism means being up to date. And yet here we have this first great modern novelist in the middle, really at the climax of his novel, having Stephen wandering through the streets of Dublin thinking about the philosophy of Thomas Aquinas. An unusual pastime, to say the least. Again, not here, but in most places. Finally, as he's walking around along the quays of the River Liffey that runs through Dublin with his friend Lynch, his friend, provokes him into finally sharing what's been on his mind, his aesthetic philosophy according to the mind of Aquinas. And so this is what Stephen says. Aquinas, said Stephen, says that is beautiful, the apprehension of which pleases. Lynch nodded. I remember that, he said. Pulchra sunt quae visa placet. He uses the word visa, said Stephen, to cover aesthetic apprehensions of all kinds, whether through sight or hearing or through any other avenue of apprehension. This word, though it is vague, is clear enough to keep away good and evil which excite desire and loathing. It means certainly a stasis and not a kinesis. How about the true? It produces also a stasis of the mind. You would not write your name in pencil across the hypotenuse of a right-angled triangle. No, said Lynch. Give me the hypotenuse of the Venus of Praxiteles. That's such a funny line, but I had to cut out the part that makes it funny. Stephen's saying that art should induce stasis, as in a sort of stability or freezing of your mind in contemplation, rather than kinesis, which would be associated with, say, looking at something that gets you rather hot and bothered. And Lynch objects because he once saw a naked statue in a museum and graffitied his name on her backside. And Stephen said, well, I'm talking about normal people. Static, therefore, said Stephen. Plato, I believe, said that beauty is the splendor of truth. I don't think that it has a meaning, but the true and the beautiful are akin. Truth is beheld by the intellect, which is appeased by the most satisfying relations of the intelligible. Beauty is beheld by the imagination, which is appeased by the most satisfying relations of the sensible. The first step in the direction of truth is to understand the frame and scope of the intellect itself, to comprehend the act itself of intellection. This is Stephen continuing. Aristotle's entire system of philosophy rests upon his book of psychology, and that, I think, rests on his statement that the same attribute cannot at the same time and in the same connection belong to and not belong to the same subject. The first step in the direction of beauty is to understand the frame and scope of the imagination, to comprehend the act itself of aesthetic apprehension. Is that clear? But what is beauty? Asked Lynch impatiently. Out with another definition. Something we see and like, is that the best you and Aquinas can do? At this point, Stephen and Lynch are interrupted by several classmates coming up to them, the noises of the city. But at long last, Stephen gets a chance to provide Lynch an answer. What, according to himself and to Thomas Aquinas, is beautiful? Is the beautiful. To finish what I was saying about beauty, said Stephen. I'll give you this too. The most satisfying relations of the sensible must therefore correspond to the necessary phases of artistic apprehension. Find these, and you find the qualities of universal beauty. Aquinas says, ad pulchritudinem tria. John mentioned hearing me lecture years ago on Jacques Maritain, and I remember butchering the French, and now I'm going to butcher the Latin. I might just skip that just for your sake. I'll get these key words here, though. He says, integritas consonantia claritas. I translate it so. 3 things are needed for beauty: wholeness, harmony, and radiance. Do these correspond to the phases of apprehension? Are you following? Asked Stephen. Of course I am, said Lynch. If you think I have an excrementious intelligence, run after Donovan and ask him to listen to you. Stephen pointed to a basket, which a butcher's boy had slung inverted on his head. Look at that basket, he said. I see it, said Lynch. In order to see that basket, said Stephen, your mind, first of all, separates the basket from the rest of the visible universe, which is not the basket. The first phase of apprehension is a bounding line drawn about the object to be apprehended. An aesthetic image is presented to us, either in space or in time. What is audible is presented in time. What is visible is presented in space. But temporal or spatial, the aesthetic image is first luminously apprehended as self-bounded and self-contained upon the immeasurable background of space and time, which is not it. You apprehend it as one thing. You see it as one whole. You apprehend its wholeness. That is integritas. Bullseye, says Lynch, laughing. Go on. Then, said Stephen, you pass from point to point. Led by its formal lines, you apprehend it as balanced part against part within its limits. You feel the rhythm of its structure. In other words, the synthesis of immediate perception is followed by the analysis of apprehension. Having first felt that it is one thing, you feel now that it is a thing. You apprehend it as a complex, multiple, divisible, separable, made up of its parts, the result of its parts, and their sum harmonious, that is to say, consonantia. Bullseye again, says Lynch wittily. Tell me now, what is claritas? And you win the cigar. The connotation of the word, Stephen said, is rather vague. Aquinas uses a term which seems to be inexact. It baffled me for a long time. It would lead you to believe that he had in mind symbolism or idealism, the supreme quality of beauty being a light from some other world, the idea of which the matter is but the shadow, the reality of which is but the symbol. I thought he might mean that claritas is the artistic discovery and representation of the divine purpose in anything, or a force of generalization which would make the aesthetic image a universal one. But that's literary talk. I understand it so. When you have apprehended that basket as one thing, and have then analyzed it according to its form and apprehended it as a thing, you make the only synthesis which is logically and aesthetically permissible. You see that it is the thing which it is and no other thing, the radiance of which he speaks of in the scholastic quidditas, the whatness of a thing. This is the supreme quality. It goes on, and it goes on much longer than these excerpts I'm giving you, but I think that's enough for one night. What has happened here? Stephen in his effort to become an artist, Joyce in his first outing as a novelist, are both drawing directly on the language of Thomas Aquinas to explain what art and beauty are. The language on which he draws, beauty is that which pleases when seen and has for its condition integritas, consonantia, and claritas. These are all snatched directly from Aquinas' Summa Theologica. I want to come back to this language later tonight, but for the moment, really, I just want to make a very superficial, but I think still worthwhile point. again, what is our context? This is the first great novel of the first great modernist novel. Modernism was a movement in the arts and letters that most people define as beginning in 1914, the first year of the First World War, and ending roughly with the start of the Second World War. So it's the great artistic period between the two wars, including the first one, when artists called into question virtually every assumption about the nature of the arts and the nature of beauty, and in consequence, those things were changed, at least in practice, if not in principle. I have to confess, and I'm a bit of a curmudgeon here, I think most of modernism is a failure, and not just because the art of any time is usually a failure, but because there was something frequently especially egregious about much of modernism. But it still does some very interesting things. If there's one thing that all the modernist arts had in common, it was the facile but believable claim that something new had happened in human history that had eventuated in a new era. And so to be a modern artist was to say, as Virginia Woolf said, human nature has somehow changed, and therefore our understanding of the beautiful, our understanding of the arts must change in accordance with it in order to keep up with it. Well, we've all lived through this because we've all seen, say, the decadent, highly wrought architecture of the late 19th century, and then we've also seen poured concrete buildings. Once you've seen those two buildings and can tell the difference between them, you're already an expert in modernism. So I guess I won't belabor the definition too much. But what we have with Joyce here is, in writing a deliberately modernist novel that is doing so many things, in fact, that have never been done in the novel before. I was talking with some people about this just last night, that that Portrait of the Artist is generally regarded as the first novel, for instance, to use in its fullness the stream of consciousness technique, where you follow the intricate movements of the psyche of a character, and the whole novel is mediated through that consciousness. If you look back 10, 15 years, 20 years to the novels of Henry James, you see novels that follow very closely the movements of one's thinking, but they're always mediated in some way by the author sort of guiding you through it. Joyce doesn't mind confusing you in the name of giving you kind of an exact representation of the movements of the psyche. And this is just one of many distinctive traits of the novel. Most broadly conceived, though, modernism is a movement that says human nature has changed. Therefore, we have to call into question the practice of the arts, our understanding of beauty, and we need to do so in the name of being up to date. But something funny is happening here. Stephen is our little proto-modernist novelist, and as he's walking through the streets of Dublin, he can think of no other way to explain what it means to make the beautiful in this distinctive new way, except with the help of the vocabulary of a saint 800 years his senior. Now, there are all kinds of qualifications that we might add to this. For instance, this is a novel where James Joyce is writing about his younger self, so he's often kind of making fun of his younger self, a little bit embarrassed about the pretentiousness of his younger years. We see in this little passage that Stephen recognizes that his education in scholastic philosophy that he seems to be getting at the Catholic University of Ireland is very much provincial. It's from the margins of European civilization, and so he's never going to be looked at. The language he's using, he recognizes, will look arcane to most people. I'll just read this passage real quickly. It wounded Stephen to think that he would never be but a shy guest at the feast of the world's culture, and that the monkish learning, in terms of which he was striving to forge out an aesthetic philosophy, was held no higher by the age he lived in than the subtle and curious jargons of heraldry and falconry. So to speak the language of a Thomas Aquinas, he recognizes on most ears it's going to sound as if he's, an antique dealer. But in fact, he needs this language he says, in order to express this new conception of art that he wants to bring into being. Now, little digression here, it's quite interesting. It's actually it's an open question whether James Joyce himself, as a student in the late 19th century at the Catholic University of Ireland, would have been introduced to Thomas Aquinas at all. Late 19th century Catholic seminary education and early 20th century Catholic seminary education would have been chock full of Aquinas at this time. And by the early 20th century, just to give you a quick example, if you were a student at Notre Dame for the first half of the 20th century, you would have taken a sequence of, I think, 4 courses that were a systematic building up of philosophy and metaphysics according to the mind of Aquinas. But at the time that Stephen was in school, it's actually an open question whether there would have been any Aquinas taught there at all, because the Irish colleges were basically existed just to prepare young Irishmen to take the civil service exam for the British Empire and get posted to far off India. And studying scholastic philosophy wouldn't have been a whole lot of help for those exams. It was more, can you spell cat? So it's possible, it's not certain, but it's possible that Joyce is reinventing his own youth to say that he was a student of Thomas Aquinas in school, whereas in fact he may have had to have learned all of this stuff on his own. Could be worse use of your time. So here's what's happening. If you look at this painting, Parisian Rainstorm by Eliot, which many of you probably know from the Chicago Art Institute, that's actually an impressionist painting, but it has many attributes that that would be in common with the ages before modernism. It's supremely realistic. It's surprisingly unimpressionistic in that Eliot has gone to such length to reproduce the precise shimmer of rain upon the cobblestones. So that's what before modernism looks like. You see, after modernism, to the right, this Rothko painting, this great solid chunk of red on a field of orange that doesn't represent anything. It seeks rather to manifest itself as a new kind of being. This is very much in keeping with the spirit of what Stephen has said in this long exchange with Lynch. You see the basket, and you see it as standing forth in being, apart from everything else, just being itself. This is what so much of the visual arts of modernism attempted to do, the standing forth of the swath of red paint on Rothko's canvas that is intended to bring you, in Stephen's words, into a condition of stasis, where you contemplate the form and don't look beyond the form to start asking questions of, is that form a good likeness? You can ask about Caillebotte, well, did he really get the streets of Paris just right? But Rothko stops you and forces you to see the form itself and to take it as an end in itself. This kind of experimentation in the thisness, or the just manifesting of form that modernism took as such a serious project, reaches its point of what you might call reductio ad absurdum in this famous work of art that I show you down below, which is Marcel Duchamp's famous work of art, Fountain, which is a urinal he purchased, signed a name R. Mutt to it, and stuck it in a museum. Duchamp is being ironic and he's not serious, I guess you might say. And yet, there is something serious to be contemplated here. Is the mere manifestation of something as real, is that sufficient to make it beautiful? According to Stephen's aesthetic philosophy, it is. And we see in Rothko and Duchamp various attempts to ask the question, is this beautiful just by setting it in isolation and allowing it to be? Or do we want to hurry back to our Caillebottes as soon as we can? That's a question for you to decide. So as I observe, Stephen thinks of himself as a kind of provincial outlier. He wants to do something new. He's a true modernist in the sense of trying to think of a new way of manifesting beauty as simply standing apart and taking its place in the realm of being. And he thinks that he's alone in doing this. Solitude is a continuous feature of Joyce's novel, as if Stephen's the only one who's thinking about these things. And I'm sure among his friends he was, but he's not the only one in his age who was thinking about these things. Indeed, to the contrary, he was one of many. Only 4 years after Joyce published his novel Portrait of the Artist, Jacques Maritain, the great French philosopher and convert to Catholicism, published his book, Art and Scholasticism. Maritain's study offers a philosophy of art and beauty that does, at length and in great detail, much of what Stephen attempted to do with his brief discourse with Lynch on the streets of Dublin. And this book had an influence that far outstripped virtually any similar treatise of the early 20th century. It was read throughout Paris and then around the world and was printed in many different editions. What you're seeing there on the screen is the first French edition, and then the first English translation published in England in, was it 1928? And then the third one there is actually the edition that happily I found as a student in a used bookstore, but it's 1960s edition when it was just such a wide-selling mass-market paperback that it had to be made cheaply available to American students. So Maritain doesn't just borrow a few words from Aquinas. Maritain cites in detail and discusses 36 different passages from Aquinas' thought in order to outline a modernist philosophy of art and of beauty. So with this, Maritain introduced Thomas Aquinas as somebody who every French intellectual had to know and understand if he was going to be thought of as up to date. Less than a decade later, a person who's very dear to several people in this room, T.S. Eliot, will do something similar. Eliot, of course, was the most influential English poet of Anglo-American poet, maybe I should say, of the early 20th century. And he was the editor of the Criterion Review, which he allowed to be described, without endorsing it, but as an organ for a Frenchified doctrine called Neo-Thomism. So Eliot, this influential poet with his influential magazine, allows the contents of that magazine to be identified with Aquinas and the Neo-Thomist movement. So much so that a younger poet, W.H. Auden, would write in 1936 that, thinking about his years of sort of being influenced by Eliot and the Criterion, he says that he bought and praised but did not read Aquinas. At the Criterion's verdict, I was mute. So he accepted the authority of Thomas Aquinas as sort of the patron saint of the Criterion and of English letters at that time. And so, but even though he confessed he didn't really know anything about Aquinas, Aquinas' authority was quite magisterial for a young English poet at this time. So what I'd like to do with the time remaining tonight is three things, and I hope I can do them in a fairly small compass. I want to provide just a very cursory reminder or news to some people of what occasioned the revival of Aquinas, period. And we'll see that it was a revival that didn't just happen in Dublin with Stephen Dedalus and James Joyce or with T.S. Eliot or Jacques Maritain, but was a sort of worldwide global phenomenon. Then I want to just give you 4 reasons why not just people in general, not just Catholics, but artists became fascinated by Aquinas. What was the attraction or the allure that Aquinas had for them? And then I want to just end by reflecting on the 4th of those reasons, which I think was important, but that was largely misunderstood. So let's So briefly, this is Pope Leo XIII, who in 1879 published the encyclical letter Aeternae Patris. The encyclical proposed that Thomas Aquinas' philosophy was exemplary and should be followed as a means of the renewal of Catholic thought in general. Why a philosopher whose writings in, 1279 were briefly condemned as heretical, why would the Pope at the end of the 19th century be recommending this saint as a model for modern thought? The answer is really not far to find. In brief, Aquinas made a very obvious observation. You can't prove what is obviously true by way of what is less obvious. You can't prove things that you just take for granted as known by means of things that you can't take for granted. Seems a rather abstract premise, but the way in which that pans out is you start with the fact of being, that things are, and you proceed from there. To just give you a quick sort of epigram, Jacques Maritain will write in 1932, "Being is, therefore I am," which is an inversion of a very famous phrase from René Descartes from the 17th century, cogito, I think, ergo sum, therefore I am. What this means is that you start from the fact of being and build your knowledge from there, rather than doing what Descartes and the modern philosophers who followed him tried to do, which was to begin with epistemology, that is, to begin with the effort to prove that you have the capacity to know before you could affirm that you know anything. You could see why this might have appealed to people, because it's a circular argument to prove that you can know anything before you claim you can know anything. Because if you couldn't already know anything, then you could never prove that you could know anything. Right? You have to assume that. So this sounds all pretty banal, and it is kind of banal. What was one of the things that was attractive about Aquinas was that he was, as Father Garrigou-Lagrange put it, actually I think Chesterton also said this, he was the philosopher of common sense. The assumption that you begin with what you already know and you build from there. The reason that this was so important to the church at the end of the 19th century was because of various versions of what Leo's successor, Pius X, would call immanentism. Immanentism is the idea that if you observe a phenomenon, you have to explain it in terms of what is less than it. So what does that mean? Well, in the age of Darwin, you hear that if there's some moral action, that it needs to be explained in some sort of biological need for reproduction. So you reduce the moral to the biological function. Or in the case of thought, you have an idea. You say, how is it that I can know this idea that seems to know the truth? Well, you try to explain it in terms of the chemical processes of the brain. So you're taking thought and reducing it to its physical manifestation. The third one, and for obvious reasons, this is the one that concerned the church most, and in fact, which gave the name immanentism its birth, was the increasingly common claim that came into currency mostly through German idealist thinkers and German theologians, that religion which claims to be the truth about God, was in fact best explained as a projection of the human person's need for God. So to reduce anything we claim about the truth, as it were, out there to a psychological need in here. If these three forms of immanentism were true, then goodness would be evacuated and reduced to environmental necessity or genetic necessity. Truth would be reduced to a function of brain chemistry. and then the whole radiance of being that we think of as creation would be reduced to some kind of psychological need on the part of the person. So the church found Aquinas, with his common sense beginning, a bulwark to stand against these three modes of immanentism. There were other things it stood against, but those are the three most pressing. But what about the artists? The four answers that we might offer for the artists fall under the rubrics, and let's see if I have a slide for you. I think I do. Yeah. There were four reasons that Aquinas was very attractive to artists. The first one was his defense of intellectualism over sentimentalism. The second was his defense of workmanship over divine madness. His third was, and this is going to be a little bit of a confusing one, but it's actually the second most interesting of the four, hylomorphic or sacramental realism. And then fourth, beauty as a transcendental property of being. And it's this fourth one that I think is most important, but it's the one that's least commented upon in the early 20th century. And so that's where we're going to end up, is with that one. So what do these four things mean? Beginning in the late 18th century, both moral action, ethics, and also artistic action, the appreciation of beauty or the making of beautiful things, was increasingly relegated to the realm of the sentiments. We have modern economics founded by the theory of moral sentiments by Adam Smith, but we have also Immanuel Kant's third critique, which has a clear place for the intellect in the appreciation of beauty, but where he leaves things rather ambiguous, and so really it's in your sentimental feelings where you affirm things as beautiful. This had led, of course, had been fostered by, but also led to the triumph of what's often called the Romantic movement, which celebrated human feeling and made the expression of human feeling the goal, the telos, the purpose of art. Well, when you start from Aquinas, there's no room for sentiments. For Aquinas, the two crucial terms about reality are being, that which is real, and intellect, which is the faculty of the real. And we have different kinds of intellect. There's the creative intellect of God that causes beings to be. And then there's the intellect of the human person that, through its spiritual capacity to take forms of the beings into itself, the human intellect has the capacity to know and participate in the truth of things. What this did for Eliot, Maritain, and myriad other artists at the period is it affirmed that art is primarily a way of knowing and of encountering reality, being. It is not merely an excrescence produced by your feelings. So that was the first allure of Aquinas. The second one is quite closely related. If you have a philosophy of art that privileges the feelings, then you're going to come up with theories about artists that highlight the feelings as well. So some of you will know William Wordsworth's great statement in the preface to the Lyrical Ballads that when he asks himself, what is a poet? And his answer is, you'll be glad to know, poets are people like the rest of us, only they feel more deeply. This is not the kind of thing that needed to be heard in the wake of the Second World War, where feelings were very dubious. Feelings of patriotism hadn't done anybody a whole lot of good at that moment. Feelings, sentiments seemed to be a muddle, a mess, a muck. And so Aquinas provided a beautiful a beautiful way of thinking through what it means to be an artist that was not in terms of the feelings. If you highlight feelings in the arts, then the artistic process is going to be thought of as a sort of reception of overwhelming feelings and then its expression in the work of art. According to Maritain, and this is a quotation from Maritain, Thomas Aquinas teaches us that art is a virtue of the intellect that has for its end the making of a work. Sounds pretty dry, and that's the point. A shipbuilder builds a ship. A carpenter builds a house or a table. An artist writes a poem. A sculptor chisels a statue. The cult of sentiments in the 19th century had separated the fine artist from the artisan, the inspired genius from the plain workman. But Aquinas' theory of art is that all art is the same. It's just an intellectual virtue that has as its end the making of a work. And so it was a breath of not just fresh air, but of humility for artists to learn that instead of trying to be sages or demigods, they could just be humble craftsmen once again. Sometimes it's hard to square this with the insane excesses of modernism because it seems as if you'd have to have a tremendous ego to do some of the things of the modern artists. But for many modern artists, it was in fact the extinction of the ego that was so attractive. And so we have this wonderful line. This is from Mariton's book, Reflections on Intelligence. It's from the same page where he's actually celebrating T.S. Eliot, as it happens. Artists and poets no longer want to be mages or gods, Dionysius or Apollo at their choice, but rather to be good works, less naive, however, than Cézanne, who felt within himself the necessity of submitting himself to the object. At the same time, and these two demands are not easy to reconcile, they insist that the poetry they make should penetrate within the most secret recesses, often low, sometimes high, of created existence. So we see these first 2 points that I gave you reconciled. On the one hand, there's a great glory to the artist because the artist as intellectual is fixing upon being, upon reality, and trying to enter deeply into it. On the other hand, the way he does it is by a humble work of craftsmanship rather than pretending that he's a prophet or a mage or a demigod. These two were very great causes, again, of attraction to Aquinas' thought. But I think it's the third point, hylomorphic or sacramental realism, that most gripped people's attention. Let's see if I have a slide for you. Yes, I will in just a second. We all know that what you see when you look at a work of visual art, for instance, is a shape, and the shape appears. In the 19th century, with the invention of photography and then film, the capacity to reproduce or to imitate precisely appearances was made much, much easier. With the advance in the physical sciences, the ability to describe precisely phenomena, that is to say, the appearance of physical activities, was also made more precise. And so the live question became, is what appears the only thing that is real? We have such mastery over appearance now. Is there anything left over? And of course, for many people, the answer is no. That which is real is that which appears. You all learned this in elementary school when you learned the scientific method. You don't really know something according to the scientific method until it can be repeated. The reason, and what is repetition? It's the ability to make something appear twice. It appears, and then you confirm the appearance. But according to Aristotle, and who was the master of Aquinas, and so also according to Aquinas, a thing is not just in terms of its shape or its appearance, a thing is what it is in terms of its interior or its ontological form. A form is a thing's essence, its definition, its manifestation as a kind of being. Mariton waxes very poetical when he talks about form, and I think with good reason. He says here, this is from Art and Scholasticism, the form, the principle which constitutes the proper perfection of all that is, which constitutes and achieves things in their essences and qualities, which is, finally, the ontological secret that they bear within them, their spiritual being, their operating mystery. The form, indeed, is above all the proper principle of intelligibility, the proper clarity of everything. Besides, every form is a vestige or a ray of the creative intelligence imprinted at the heart of created being. Now, what is this saying? If you look at an appearance, you'd say that appearance has a form. A toaster is shaped like yay. Mariton's proposing that there's the appearance of the form, but there's also the interior essence, the inner mystery of a thing, the form in Aristotle and Aquinas' deep sense. Now, I think by and large, Mariton's not reading Aquinas really well here, but leaving that aside for the moment, what he sees, therefore, is a justification for works of art, that is to say, works that appear to us, that have as their primary purpose to initiate us into the interior mystery of things. Here are the two painters who most inspired Mariton. Georges Rouault, on your left there, whose paintings basically taught Mariton everything that he thought about art, which he needed, just like young Stephen, he needed Aquinas to help explain it to himself. And then to the right is Maurice Denis, who I think is, for my money, the better painter. But they're both cited repeatedly in Art of Scholasticism as exemplary of what Mariton imagines the true art should be. What do we see here? Well, down low, we see Rouault painting the face of Christ, but of course, there's no effort at verisimilitude. There's no effort at reproducing the appearance of things exactly. It's rather the appearance on the canvas serves primarily to try to reveal to us an inner mystery, a spiritual mystery. And same with the Denis portrait on the lower right there, which you saw at the outset, which is women coming to Christ's grave, this luminosity first of the cool blue of dawn, and then the gold of the angel, speaking of a revelation pulsing from within things. The artist's job is not to reproduce the apparent form, but the essential form of things, which is why the artist, so in other words, when an artist does something like this, you don't just accuse him of ham-handedness and say, my 8-year-old could do that, although that might be the case. I once went into a library where there were a bunch of 8-year-olds who had been charged with imitating a Picasso, and I thought, why didn't you just tell them to paint on their own? You know, would have been the same. But I mean, there may well be ham-handedness, but that's not the purpose of it. It's that the artist has abandoned the effort to reproduce the appearances of reality, and because the artist is questing after revealing the ontological secret of the depths of being. It seems to me that on the one hand, many modernist artists go too far because they create too much of a chasm between appearance and reality, whereas in fact, we know that there's a great closeness and kinship between these things. Otherwise, we couldn't express thoughts with words or with our faces, but we can. But on the other hand, as a way of pushing back against a reductive kind of immanentism that reduced everything to appearances, I think this was a very sound gesture. Oh, where did Pete the cat come from? I know, I know where he's coming from. Pete the cat represents to me the fourth and final step. I'm going to take you back to that real quick. Beauty as a transcendental property of being. In Art and Scholasticism, Mariton is never closer to Aquinas than in that chapter. And in that chapter, he says something, I think, of such brilliant and lasting consequences that it should change our life the moment we hear it. Alas, it seems to be the one thing about Aquinas that people ignored in the early 20th century, even though Mariton had made a brief argument about it. In fact, even Mariton ignores it. He writes one chapter on the nature of beauty, and then he spent the rest of his life, whenever he wrote about arts, talking about the psychology of the poet and how they make things. He just had no interest in this, his most brilliant insight. What does it mean, beauty is a transcendental property of being? Well, I think I can explain it pretty quickly. Every being that we encounter is a kind of being. That is to say, it has a particular form. Inevitably, these explanations like these are made in classrooms, and so you inevitably refer to a chair. Every chair is a chair because it has the form of a chair. Happily, there's no dry erase marker, because that's the worst possible example, but that's the one that often gets used as well, including in a book of manual scholastic philosophy, alas. So everything that is a being is a kind of being. And every being that is a kind of being has particular properties or characteristics that are definitive of it, right? A chair is a place for sitting, for instance. That's pretty much not a bad definition of the essence of a chair. If you don't have a thing for sitting, you don't have a chair. Is there, however, anything that belongs to just being as being? That is to say, not as a kind of being, but just to being per se. If we stripped every attribute of the chairness from this particular chair away, and until we somehow got down to the raw stuff of its being, would there be anything left? Well, there wouldn't be anything existent left, but there are properties or qualities that are present in every kind of being, no matter what kind of being it is. And these came to be called the transcendental properties of being. So it sounds like something out of the Beatles, transcendental meditation or something like that, but what it means is it just defies it transcends the various categories of kinds of being. I'll give you a quick list of them. 1, if you're talking about something, it's a thing, right? You can't, if you're calling something a being, it's one being. Yes, it may be constituted by millions of atoms, but those atoms in themselves go on to compose the single unified thing that is this chair, that giraffe, and so on and so forth. Well, if something when it is one, then when I know it, I'll say, right, that's wine, that's a chair. Well, if that's the case, that means I can identify the truth about a being. So the truth of something inheres in it as a transcendental property, as a property of itself. Some chairs, if a chair doesn't work, it falls down when you try to sit in it. You say, oh, it's a prank chair. It's not a true chair. It's a true prank. But if you can sit in the chair, then it's a chair. It's true. Third, everything, insofar as it exists, is, on the one hand, the outcome of some process that brought it into being. Therefore, it's the good or end product of something. But also, everything insofar as it exists serves some kind of function beyond its mere existence, whether it's the flourishing of a human life or a hammer is used to hammer in nails, so on and so forth. And so things are also good for things. So goodness is itself a transcendental property of being, which is why I find Pete the cat so helpful, because one of his phrases is it's all good, and that's because he's a scholastic philosopher and he knows that everything insofar as it has being is good. But beauty, why beauty? How can beauty be a transcendental property of being? After all, usually we say, that's a beautiful picture, by which we mean the other three around it are not. Well, that's true. We usually use the word beauty to signify a perfection. But you know what? We use the word good and truth that way too, right? If somebody tells you something really bitter, you say, oh, that's too true. Too true, right? And then, I cook dinner once in a while. I do it, and sometimes my wife might say, oh, it's really good. But she doesn't mean that the other times I cooked that it was evil food. She just means it's not as good, right? So we use good and true, just like beauty, as a perfection. But that doesn't mean that they can't also be properties of being. Aquinas tells us that beauty is a property of being because it's rooted in the form. That is to say, it's rooted in what makes things to be real. So I'm just going to share one last thought with you, and I think it's right after Pete. What is it to be beautiful? Those 3 words that Stephen used in the passage that we read at the beginning tonight appear in Aquinas, and they define the conditions, or what makes something beautiful. First, integritas. Something is beautiful insofar as it's a whole. It has a fullness of being proper to itself. But then, when you see something as a whole, you begin to think, right, this is a whole because I can tell that the different parts interior to it are proportioned to one another. And come to think about it, when I see this tree here, I notice that it stands in other proportionate relationships to other trees and to the sky and to the earth. It stands in a certain proportionate relationship to me as the one who sees it, as intelligible to me, as something I can perceive. And so therefore, consonantia, proportion or harmony, is part of beauty. But there's one last proportion or consonantia that is the sort of coup de grace of them all. When I see something that exists, I know that it stands in some definite relation to that which caused it to exist. And I don't mean the maker, I mean the creator. Every being stands in relationship to as a kind of light illuminating, as a light that derives from the light that causes things to exist in the first place. And this Thomas Aquinas defines as Claritas. I hope it's already clear why I think this is such a profound insight on the part of Maritain and through Maritain Aquinas. That beauty is not a perfection that we occasionally perceive. Beauty is, in fact, the capacity of beings to stand forth and share themselves with integritas, to stand in relationship to other beings, so that when we look at the world, we don't see a jumble and a mess, we see an ordered whole. It has consonantia. And then when we see these things, we say, where did they come from? And we see that they bear within them already the light of the one who caused them to be. In the words of theologian Henri de Lubac, every being is itself a theophany, a light illuminating God. This, I think, is the final justification for why Aquinas was so attractive to the modernists, even though they didn't fully appreciate it. What it teaches us is that just by a thing standing forth in the world and being, it's like the entrance of a cave. It's the opening to a great mystery that leads us down into the depths of reality, but also up a great ladder to the divine. And this is why every being is somehow a theophany. So I've taken enough of your time tonight. I thank you for your patience, and I'm very grateful for your attention. I know that was luminously clear, but I think I was supposed to take some questions if anybody had any.
If there are questions, please use the microphone here if you have a question. Moving around.
Yep. You can come up to the front one up here to ask your question if you feel comfortable, or raise your hand and I can come around and bring you one as well. Check.
In regards to consonantia, the harmony, so for instance, I think of the Schoenberg School of Music, right? They're deliberately being disharmonious. That would be by nature unbeautiful, correct?
Good question. So I think the way to approach that question would be to say, when you're talking about consonantia, when you're talking about proportions, you're also always talking about ratio, so reason, but as in ratios, relationships. And so the disharmony of Schoenberg, I mean, I don't want to end up defending later Schoenberg, though I love actually early Schoenberg, but what he was trying to do was to show a series of what we might think of as mathematical relationships between tones. And insofar as you can perceive those relationships, you're likely to say, this is beautiful. The thing is, there are so many proportions. There are so many possible proportions that, because beauty is not about one particular perfection, it's about the way in which things are in themselves and in relation to other things, that some relationships, some perceptions may be perceptible to one person and not to another. So the easy argument would be to say, in Schoenberg's case, if you perceive those relationships, if you can see what he's doing, you might appreciate it as beautiful. Now, but then you would have to say, But these relationships are really poor in comparison with the kinds of relationships that are developed, say, in the tonality of the rest of the classical music tradition. Because it's revealing, as you just said, discordances between things as much as it is accordances between them. And I think that's what places the limit upon the beauty of these things. I showed the Rothko canvas earlier. I find that fascinating to look at. It has a certain proportionate quality, but it's actually, Rothko wants it to be stark and ontologically present to us and really impress us. But what it ends up doing is having certain qualities that we can appreciate, but then seeming kind of impoverished. And so it's not an absence of beauty, it's an impoverishment of beauty that I think we encounter in a lot of works of modernist art, including Schoenberg's music.
So when you mentioned the perception in that case of maybe noticing certain things in the dissonance, is that because you're just saying that there's something?
Yeah.
So when you mentioned I hope I can remember the question, the difference in perception, do you mean that one person is lacking the ability to see what they're, or are you saying that there is no real objectivity to beauty?
Nope. The beauty is in the being. So it's objective. Objective and subjective are not the right words for it, but the beauty is real, as in it's part of the being of the thing that exists. But inevitably, we are going to be more or less perceptive of being in general, whether it's in terms of the category of truth, the category of goodness, or the category of beauty, which is why aesthetic education is possible. It's possible to teach someone to perceive the proportions in things, and even something that is so readily accessible, as in we perceive its beauty immediately. We say, this is a thing of beauty right away. Even in the case of those things, maybe especially in the case of those things, aesthetic education, that is to say the study of it, only deepens our appreciation of its beauty as we become more perceptive of it. When I go around an art museum, I find it an immensely rewarding experience, but I have a friend who happens to know everything about every painting. He once walked me through an entire museum and not only told me how much each individual painting was worth and where all the other works by this artist were located at different museums in the United States, but he explained exactly why this particular painting was distinctive in one way or another. And that wasn't merely effluvium, it wasn't just fluff, it wasn't just trivia. In hearing these things, in being led to perceive features that are more deeply buried within the being of the work of art, I came to appreciate the work of art more deeply.
But before leaving Schoenberg, I never met the man, of course, but I did work in the field of acoustics and entertainment. And I did get a chance to meet and talk with several different modern composers. And the word they always used in describing their work was they're trying to produce something interesting as opposed to something enjoyable.
Right.
And of course, that goes back to Schoenberg's definition of relationships between frequencies, which is a mathematical concept, but sensually perceived. But it is missing what we find harmonious and therefore pleasing. And it struck me, and I told them, well, no, I won't tell them because it was rather crass, but it seemed to be solely at the composer's self-pleasure in composing it, not in a sense of communicating any inherent truth to an audience. And most of them kind of agreed with that.
Yes.
And so I just wanted to share that.
Well, that's a good anecdote and observation to make. Peter Gay, who was a really mostly a historian of Freud and psychoanalysis, but late in his life he produced a book called Modernism, the Lure of Heresy. And the contention of that book was that what held the modernists all together across continents was that they were attracted to whatever was heretical, and therefore always prioritized self-expression as to be a self-advocate of heresy, as opposed to a conformity to a tradition. And I think that's on one hand, it's in one sense impoverished, in one sense it's true. I think that's present within modernism, and I think, for instance, out of modernism comes postmodern architecture, which my architecture friends tell me is entirely explicitly about self-expression. What I see is happening there is that they're failing to appreciate what really was the genuinely great insight of modernism, which was that in favor of things that are of lesser importance within modernism. What was the great insight of modernism? Was the attention to being, the sense of the real and the way in which the mind can attach to it. You mentioned Schoenberg and mathematics is especially to the point. In fact, I had a part in my comments tonight that I was going to share and I ended up not doing, but that a lot of the early thinkers trying to figure out what modernism were doing compared it to mathematics. Because what is the mathematical order? Well, if we say somebody's a number cruncher, we're not flattering his humanity. Early modernists thought in order to get beyond appearances, they had to rise up by way of the abstraction of mathematicals. And in one sense, they're right, as in math is one of the clues by which we know that there's more to the world than appearances, because math itself doesn't appear. It describes the innermost workings interior workings of reality, but it doesn't itself appear. The mistake I think those modernists make, and I'll just give you one example, T.E. Hume, who was a great influence on T.S. Eliot and Ezra Pound and other Anglophone modernists, he was the great advocate of mathematics as sort of a basis. The mistake they make is the same mistake that Aristotle corrects in his Metaphysics when he chastises Pythagoras, the founder of the Pythagorean theorem, which is that number is in being, but being is the ultimate term of reality. And so what I see from what you were just describing, what I hear is somebody getting hooked on mathematics as a way of perceiving reality, not recognizing that there's more even to the world than numbers. And so it's a kind of impoverishment. Did I just insult the mathematician?
Well, while we're talking about math, though, no, you've convinced me of something very new to me, and that is the math theorem itself. People say, what a beautiful theorem. Uh-huh. I think they're wrong. What is beautiful is the proof. How does this turn out to be true? How does this theorem fit in with other known things? How do people participate and savor this thing? It is like a piece of music. It is like a piece of art. And but the theorem itself is the picture in the frame. You can take a picture, you can look at it. But until you know why it is true, how it has come about, then it's beautiful. Do I have it?
I don't want to make it an either or. You're not even going to wait for the answer, right? Okay. No, just kidding. Yeah. Yes. No, yeah. Long-time listener, first-time caller. So, yeah. This is what I love about Aquinas this is a whole nother lecture, I'm afraid, but I'm going to be quick. This is what I love about Aquinas' three-part definition of beauty: integritas, consonantia, and claritas. Aquinas is the only person that I'm aware of in the history of the philosophy of beauty that uses those three terms. I mean, after he uses it, lots of people use them. I'm using them right now. But before him, nobody used it. The term that was used for beauty before Aquinas gave us those three terms was form and splendor. Plato says that beauty is the splendor of truth. Well, what is a truth for Plato? It's a form. But then every form is splendid. That is to say, it radiates beyond itself. So what I like about Aquinas' tripartite is that he refuses any kind of either or. Beauty isn't just the exact realization of a form, nor is beauty just that sort of strange radiance that we can't always explain that seems to come out of things that we find beautiful and striking. It's rather, beauty is a series of relationships. It's the relationship of a thing to itself, its integrity, which is the proof itself. But it's also its relationship to other things, including the way in which we discover it. And then, of course, there's that moment where we say, right, now that I understand this proof, I see it in relation to that one, and the world starts to build up before your eyes like a great structure, and you say, now I really understand how all things are. And at that moment, you have wisdom, which in both the philosophical tradition dating from Plato and Aristotle, in both Christian theology, and in the great text where those two meet, the biblical book of wisdom, we find that there is an identity between wisdom and beauty. In fact, to be honest with you, that was where I was going to go with this whole lecture, but there was so much else to say that I just thought, oh, forget it. They don't care about wisdom. No time for wisdom. Yes?
I've got a couple of questions. One, was that square patch of red painting, was that artist part of the modernist movement, or is that coming after?
That's after. That's abstract expressionism. What I like,
Okay.
That's Rothko. What I like about the abstract expressionists is that they clarify some of the things that were operating in modernism. Rarely do you get. Oh, I thought I had. There we are. A little cubism would be more typical of modernist art, right? Rothko's a sort of further abstraction from that.
Okay. All right, so that gets to the question, maybe it's a little unfair to you, but what happens then after modernism, and does Aquinas have anything to say about, or that can be used, Aquinas, to help illuminate what happens to art after this period? And it seemed to me, based on what you said about the artist doesn't rearrange sensible forms to make it a work that, that's how things appear to us when we see it. The artist is arranging the sensible forms in order to get at something deeper behind them, the intelligible form behind the sensible form. And it seems like Rothko is what he's doing is he's saying, no, there's nothing behind there. Just rearrange the sensible forms in order to call people's attention just to the sensible form. Let your consciousness dwell on just the quality of this red, and that's it. There's nothing else. I mean, is that what happens?
Well,
next?
so
I don't know.
so
I don't even know
that's
what my
definitely a
question is.
possibility. As a practicing poet, the sort of personal stake in this whole meditation that I was offering tonight is to figure out where the modern arts, including modern poetry, went wrong, and also where they went right. Where I think they went right was the reassertion of, if you forgive the term, the art as ontological, art as converging upon being, and as being disclosive of the real. But beginning with in the decades after modernism, which would include Rothko, and what you give is a plausible definition of Rothko, though it's certainly not the one I favor. But with the abstract expressionists and thereafter it's a failure of historical memory. They see what the artists are doing physically, but they fail to understand what's at stake in it. And so then works of visual art become a kind of game of appearances, just a series of superficial forms. And then in literature, it's particularly frustrating because you have, say, in Joyce and Eliot, even in Ezra Pound, you have these great poets who have made these really jagged surfaces that are not really pleasant on the surface, but they have a certain intellectual brilliance to them, and they lead you down into a kind of cavern of mystery, and you sense that you're getting someplace, you're arriving at some kind of knowledge. So then, of course, as everyone knows, there's the emergence of postmodern art and poetry, where you have a series of apparent references that in fact lead nowhere. So the novels of Thomas Pynchon are famous for this. There's clues everywhere, but the clues don't actually add up to anything. And there are two ways of evaluating that. On the one hand, it's a moment of nihilism. Well, modernism was trying to arrive at something great, and in fact, I don't think there's anything great to arrive at, and so I'm just going to undermine it playfully. Or there's a kind of barbarism, a sense of seeing the superficial practices of these artists, but not really understanding, not looking deeply enough into them to understand what was at stake. And then I think of it as barbarism, right, where you inherit the external forms or appearances of a practice or a tradition, but don't actually understand the inner essence of it. So.
You seem to have said that
It's good.
sorry.
Yeah.
You seem to have said that the modernism, in this period at least, is trying to escape the subjective. If that's an accurate way of portraying what you're.
Yes.
Well, C.S. Lewis, who took a rather different view, if I understand him correctly, and if I could indulge me for a moment, I'd like to read a few lines from a poem of his that you probably know. And I've forgotten the title, but and I'm afraid where I'm reading it from, the title isn't given. It's just this excerpt. But you may recognize it. Lewis wrote in a poem of his own, "I am so coarse, the things the poets see are obstinately invisible to me. For 20 years I've stared my level best to see if any evening would suggest a patient theorized upon a table." That's a line from the
Yes.
love song of
Yes. Yes.
Prufrock. In vain, I simply wasn't able. To me, each evening looked far more like the departure from a silent yet crowded shore of a ship whose freight was with everything, leaving behind, gracefully, finally without farewells, marooned mankind. I'm like that odd man Wordsworth knew, to whom a primrose was a yellow primrose, one whose doom keeps him forever in the list of dunces, compelled to live on stock responses, making the poor best that I can of dull things.
Mm-hmm.
I wonder what you have to say. I'm sorry. I wonder what you have.
He learned the hard way.
Yes.
Yes.
This thing. I wonder how you might respond to that, to Lewis. Unless Lewis is simply appealing to literary tradition, but I think he's making a larger point that there's a complaint against a growing subjectivity in modernism,
Yes.
against the realism that Johnson's realism, kicking the stone.
Yes. Yes. So one of the things I had meant to share somewhere on these slides was that wonderful Norman Rockwell of the man in a suit standing before the Jackson Pollock painting, implicitly scratching his head. Of the four allures of Aquinas for the artist, the third one, as I said, was this recovery of ontological form from an art, a theory of art that would reduce everything to appearances. And what Maritain was celebrating, and what other modernists were celebrating, was the idea of aesthetic form, the work of art, somehow giving representation to that interior ontic reality in defiance of appearances, right? You disfigure the appearance in order to get at the reality of things. Well, we can all understand that to some extent. That's in a manner of speaking, that's what the Greeks did when they constructed columns, right? Their columns don't go straight up into the air. They're carefully proportioned so that when you're standing beneath them, they look as if they're going straight up in the air. We understand distorting appearance in order to recover reality. But what I think was the crucial error of modernism was to believe that appearance finally had to be sacrificed at the altar of the shock of the real, of being. And I think Lewis is pushing back against that, and quite justly. It's been my project these last 15 years to insist that we recover both the harmony of appearances and the harmony of the depths. Otherwise, you really have an art, however profound it may in some sense be, that is also a kind of dissection of reality. It's ignoring a crucial part of reality, which is how things appear. So that's why I have my sympathies with modernism, but it only goes so far. I like its metaphysical thrust, but not its refusal of a savoring of the form of things that appear to the eye and to the ear. I think so. I think it frustrates its own purposes. I mean, yes, I think I'm happy with that. Yes. Oh, sorry, it's the man with the microphone, yeah.
I think it's very easy to pick on Rothko in particular.
Uh-huh.
And I am not a great Rothko fan.
Uh-huh.
But when you make the general comment that modernism has failed, essentially, it seems to me that you are assuming that there is a requirement that these painters have to meet. And I don't know what that requirement is. I think it's your requirement. And I don't know why you cannot be in favor of freedom of the artist to do whatever he wants. And you are free to laugh at it or ignore it or love it, whatever. But basic question is, where do you get your standard? And why should Rothko, Pollock, de Kooning,
Yes.
and various painters who are non-standard, not in line with classicism, why must they be beholden to your standard?
Well, my standard's a very good one, so that's one reason. But I didn't say Rothko failed. I think that what modernism is chasing after is incredibly important. I think the recovery of recognizing that the perception of beauty is the act of the intellect of the person convening upon reality, arriving at the real, is one of the great perceptions that modernism highlights. That the arts are one of the ways in which we know the world. So in that endeavor, I think they were often successful. I think if you're where I see failure, if that's the right word, is that part of what we need to know about the world is how it actually appears. And so if you're sacrificing appearances to the depths, then that strikes me as a bargain that may be in certain circumstances worth taking, but it's a hard bargain. What is my standard for this? I'm trying to think of the kind of work that I want to make.
It's personal.
Yep, well, sure.
Okay.
Yeah.
Reality is another difficult word. And I think you mean what we all perceive easily, readily. But the odd things that are made by the painters that you are considering are new things introduced to reality. They're real things.
Right, and I think that's their achievement. Yeah, and I think the reason I like Rothko's painting is because it stands out sort of defiantly as saying, "Here I am," and I don't mean the artist. I don't care about the artist. The work itself stands forth on the canvas, and refuses to let us sort of get behind it. The philosopher Alistair MacIntyre many years ago gave a lecture on what is a religious painting. In fact, that's what he held up a Rothko and a Goya, both of which were magnificent, but it was clear that his investment was in justifying the Rothko, and I understood exactly why he wanted to justify it. Because there has to be something interior to the formal principles of a work of art that make it a work of art, just as there has to be something interior to the formal principles of a poem that make it a poem. What do I mean by that? Formal as opposed to the material principles. A poem isn't a poem just because it's on a poetic subject matter. It has to have formal properties that make it a poem. A painting is a painting insofar as it has formal qualities that make it a painting. It's not just a painting because it shows, as it was the case in the Goya, the cleansing of the temple, right? Just because it has a subject beyond itself. And this is, again, I think one of the great achievements of modernism was reminding us of both the way in which art convenes upon being or upon reality, and it does that by specifically allowing the works of art to be themselves beings that don't necessarily lead us beyond themselves the way signs do. There's a
Thank you.
Does that make sense? Yeah.
Thank you, James.
Thank you.
I have so much to think about. I'm thankful that we recorded that, and we'll be putting it on the Aquinas YouTube page and the Catholic Studies page soon, I hope. So I wanted to thank you all for coming tonight. This was co-sponsored by Campus Ministry, so I want to thank the whole Campus Ministry staff, some of whom are here and left, some are still here, Terry, so thank you very much. Catholic Studies and the Catholic Studies Speaker Series is, we do not take the students' tuition dollars to fund anything in the program. In fact, we give scholarships to get students to Assisi, which is an optional trip while they're on the Rome semester program. We buy their books for them in Catholic Studies, so free books in Assisi too, and it reminds me of an 1840 campaign slogan, but maybe. So I'd just like to also thank our benefactors, without whom we would not have a Catholic Studies Speaker Series. And thank you for coming. Please drive safe. Thank you.